There's Marilee, who's on Sapphires. Marilee does science communication and lots of other things. And Lori is in Illinois, and on Sapphires, she's helping us develop training materials for home energy efficiency or weatherization contractors. And yeah, you're fine. And I'm going to let Paul introduce himself and talk about his topic. And Paul, maybe you want to say a little bit about how you would like questions, whether you want them throughout the talk or whether you want to take them all at the end.
Sure. All right. So most of you know me, at least at some level. I'm Paul Francisco. I have been I just hit 2 weeks ago, I hit 30 years working in the housing industry in one capacity or another. I have been training practitioners for about almost 20 years. I've been doing research on housing issues for pretty much the full 30 years. And with what I've done, I've got a lot of connections with programs, federal programs, utility programs, the practitioner base. So kind of as a bridge between the research world and the practitioner world. And so the intent of this presentation today is to give folks kind of just at a pretty high level, just because there's so much going on in the residential world right now, that it's kind of at a high level, trying to give people an idea of what is going on in residential around the US. And in terms of questions, ask them as we go. I feel like, if we do that and we don't get to the end, well, we've probably been having good discussion that's on the things that I was going over. And if we have to do a part two, I'll do a part two. But I don't think that's going to be necessary. But that's how I would prefer it, is to go ahead and interrupt me as we go. Again, it's going to be kind of a high level, but a lot of the reason I wanted to do this, I think we wanted to do this, is because we're working in a space where there is a huge amount of activity, and understanding understanding kind of what the landscape is that we're trying to plug into, I think will give some clarity into things like how on Sapphires, how might we plug some of what we're working on into what's already out there. And so I will get my screen going here. Yeah, it's really actually not a lot of slides because, like I said, I wanted to do it at kind of a high level. But I'm happy to go deeper on topics as we go. All right, is this sharing?
Yes.
Okay, so I can't see very many people right now because I'm sharing the screen. So nodding of heads or physically raising of hands isn't going to help. I think I will probably notice if you do the Zoom raising. Okay, so these are the topics I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk just a little bit about new construction, and it's not going to be a lot about new construction because it's easy to do things in new construction. And if one of the things we're really trying to do is focus on our lower income communities, they're not buying new houses at a very high rate. That's just not where we're going. But I do want to talk about that a little bit, just because I think it is a part of the overall landscape. And I think a lot of folks, there are a lot of organizations that tend to focus on new construction. I want to put that kind of in its context. I'll talk about existing construction, some of the laws around that, a lot about programs and policies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the organizations working in this space, and then also a little bit of the politics, not just policies, but politics. So, all right, new construction. We build in the US about 1 to 1.5 million housing units per year. That's compared to about 140 million existing units. So when people say, hey, we got to really do a great job on new construction, I'm not going to disagree, but we're not moving the needle that far when it comes to climate emissions, things like that, if all we do is focus on new construction. There are some You see here on this map here shows the current state for residential energy code adoption. And one of the things you'll notice if you look is that there's a whole lot of orange. Up in the Northeast and along the West Coast, you've got some greens, which means they're more recent code adoptions. There's a whole lot of orange. That orange that states that their current code adoption is the 2009 code. Now, you might wonder, why are there so many states that are in 2009? Well, it's quite simple. When the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act came along, ARRA, or also, it was Obama's big, like $870 billion plan to help the economy. One of the things he said was, hey, states, if you're going to be accepting any money, you have to do something about updating your codes. And so 2009 was the latest code in 2010. And so a whole lot of states moved up to the 2009 code, and then they haven't moved forward since. You also see some white ones where there's no statewide code. That doesn't mean it's the true Wild West. It means oftentimes that the state, and this is, for example, with Colorado, is saying, here's the kinds of things you need to do, each local jurisdiction. You decide how you're going to do it. So there's still rules. It's just not a specific code that's put into place for the entire state all at once. There are some jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, that are pursuing green new construction. They're really trying to go further advanced. And as we've been hearing, there are some jurisdictions banning fossil fuels in new construction. Okay, that's about all I'm going to say about new construction. I'm going to move into the residential retrofit world because that's really, I think, where both of our projects are living. And so there's kind of two models where we have residential retrofits. One is the model where you've got contractors trying to do market-based retrofits and selling their wares, selling their services to residents and bidding and all that. There's a whole lot of contractors who really have wanted for decades for this to be the primary way that work gets done, because when it's like this, they don't have to worry about program rules. They can just go and do stuff. But the reality is, if we're talking about serious whole house residential retrofits, not just my furnace went out and I need a new one, but we're really talking about whole home improvements, this approach has never gotten to be very big. So the much more prominent way that these sorts of things happen is you got the government. The government gives out money and sets down rules. And then sometimes the money and the rules go to the contractor. Sometimes the money and rules go to the residents directly. And then, of course, there is going to be a contractor involved in some way. And so then the contractor connects to the residents. And that's a lot of what's going on with the Inflation Reduction Act, or is going to be going on with the Inflation Reduction Act once each state figures out how they're going to do their stuff. There's going to be rebates that are rebates and tax incentives that are going directly to residents, but the contractors are going to be going and saying, hey, you can get these rebates, hire us to do our thing. I'm going to talk more about that later. So laws in existing construction. There's not a lot in the way of laws in existing construction. Most homes, especially the older they get, the more out of code compliance they are, because the code back when they were built is different than the ones that are there now. And there's no requirement generally to go back and fix it. So most of the existing construction laws are really about disclosure, and that'll vary by jurisdiction. One common one is radon. Lead paint, if you've got a pre-1978 house, there's questions about whether you have lead paint. Mold, obviously you don't need a piece of paper to say whether there's a mold problem in this house, but there can be disclosure about mold issues in homes. There are some things about maintenance code and tenants' rights laws for rental properties. There are also some building performance laws for existing construction. For example, in Colorado, they have a building performance statute that's just recently gone into play. It's like this summer, I think it got actually put into play, but it's really about buildings that are 50,000 square foot or larger. So it's mostly commercial, industrial, institutional. If it's going to apply to anything in the residential sector, that's really going to be in the multifamily. But hey, that is some of the housing stock that we're dealing with. Where we really see a lot of activity, amazing activity, is in national programs for existing construction. Most of the programs have, I don't know, very many, probably most of the programs really have a lot of focus on helping low-income populations. That really started out of the energy crisis in the early 1970s, 1973, 1978 is when the Weatherization program got established. So that's been now 45 years. There are, depending on the program, different income eligibility levels. There are some programs that are not about low-income families. Even among low-income programs, some of them say the income eligibility is 200% of the poverty level. Some say it's 125% of the poverty level. Somebody say it's 80% of the area median income. So they'll vary. They're still trying to serve low-income populations, but they'll vary in how they are saying, yes, you qualify for low income. But they'll also have different missions, which can be potentially a barrier. It can also be a real opportunity. So for example, we have the Weatherization program that's out of the U.S. Department of Energy. That is really focused on doing energy efficiency retrofits while maintaining health and safety. They're not trying to make the homes healthier necessarily. They're happy if they do. Just do no harm on health and save energy for low-income families. And that's the one that got born out of the energy crisis in the 1970s. So we've got every county in the country has people going out into low-income families' homes, assessing them for energy efficiency opportunities that are cost-effective, and then through the federal program, those interventions get done at no cost to the residents. It improves their home, it improves their cash flow. In some cases, they no longer have to decide, are they going to eat or have their medicine or heat their house. So it can have some really big impacts beyond just the energy. You got the Community Services Block Grant. That's out of the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. That can do a whole host of services. It can support job training. It can support healthy homes. We have some work in Illinois that's funded by the CSBG program that's on healthy homes. It can just support kind of anything that helps people in these disadvantaged communities have a better chance at success. That's where CSBG fits. And that is, so the Weatherization program is typically about $350 million a year nationally. CSBG is upwards of $800 million nationally per year. Then we've got HUD. In addition to HUD having a lot of their own housing that they manage, they also have what's called the HOME program, which does things like repairs in homes. It can do things on radon. For example, there's a program in Pennsylvania that they've got home money, and they use that funding in part to address radon issues in homes. So that's another. And we've got USDA has their rural development initiative. And so that is really about helping low-income people in rural areas get housing and improve housing. So it can do repairs, it can do roof repairs, it can do other types of repairs, and also helps to get people into housing in the first place. So one of the things I just want to show is that all of these have some connection to the potential healthiness of homes. And so when we're talking about interventions that we would like to get out into our low-income populations, there are a bunch of different programs that we could potentially plug into. Then we get away from the federal government, and you've got a lot of utility programs that have historically really been focused on energy, but there are some that are really starting to consider health and have health-focused programs within the utilities. And it's not always clear why they do that. Sometimes it's just trying to be perceived better than the utilities frequently are. There's also, I think, a recognition that if low-income families are having to spend all of their money on not being sick, then they're not able to pay their energy bill. So it helps that way. So we have reasons why the utilities are really starting to look at healthy homes in addition to the energy efficiency side of things. Then we've got some statewide programs. For example, in Illinois, they have Solar for All that's supposed to be trying to get solar energy into you know for all, so including low-income families. There are some local programs like Fort Collins, we know, has the Healthy Homes program and their own energy efficiency programs. One thing about this is the certifications for different programs are going to vary. Even if you're talking about like whole home retrofits, the certifications will vary a lot for what would be required by the program to be allowed to do the retrofits or to do the assessments to do the retrofits and things like that. So then there are policies. So that was programs. Now policies, there's for existing construction, existing homes, there are, for example, some states and some programs that have adopted the ASHRAE ventilation standard. I'm calling that one out specifically in part because with Sapphires, we're focused on solutions that integrate with ventilation. And so there are some states and programs that just require that there be ventilation as part of the program. And so there are already existing mechanisms for potential integration. And then there's just a lot of activity at the federal level, and so I'm going to talk about that next. So here are 3 programs that I'm going to talk about that are just very large programs specifically targeted at housing. So first, WAP, Weatherization Assistance Program, that's the one out of DOE. That's the one that's been around since 1978. As I said before, they have historically just been focused on energy while not making the healthiness of the homes worse. So, do no harm. One thing that's really interesting is just last year, after 44 years of having, so they do cost effectiveness calculations. You can only install a measure as an energy conservation measure if it meets cost effectiveness requirements. Until last year, those cost effectiveness requirements were based entirely on the expected energy bills and the energy use. So just last year, for the first time, they actually added social cost of carbon to that. So you can, depending on the fuel, or they also have a thing about water, but depending on the fuel, you can there's an adder for the savings part of the calculation, which will make certain things look more cost effective. It may not be putting more money into the residents' pockets, but it's allowing more measures to meet those requirements to be cost effective. There are also new readiness funds. What readiness means is recognizing there's a lot of homes where you can't do the retrofit because there's something substantially problematic with the home that makes it so the retrofits would not be durable. For example, if the roof is leaking, all the insulation that you might put in the attic is going to get wet and it's not going to be effective. And it's just going to get the ceiling wet and it might collapse the ceiling. And that's not what this is about. But because the weatherization program is not able to do roofs, they end up having to walk away from those homes and providing no services at all. So the readiness funds are a specific call out. It was $15 million from DOE in 2022, 30 million in 2023 for essentially doing those repairs that are not necessarily about energy and are not normally allowed, that makes the home ready to receive weatherization services. Well, I didn't say earlier, weatherization that's one of those 200% of poverty. There are other things as well, but 200% of poverty is the income eligibility level for weatherization. There also, one of the things that happened was when the Democrats took back the House in 2018, one of the things they really got very much interested in, and of course the Democrats got the Senate shortly, but did they get it in 2018? I don't recall when they got the Senate back, but at any rate, the House after 2018, the folks on the committees that really focus on weatherization, they really wanted to see weatherization go beyond energy. So it's kind of a congressional mandate to figure out how to account for what they call non-energy impacts, NEIs. Used to be non-energy benefits, but then they realized not all of it is a benefit, so non-energy impacts. So they really want to have weatherization be able to account for non-energy things. That's where we get the social cost of carbon being brought into it. And so now they're trying to figure out how to account for some of these other impacts, with health being one of them. And so this again is where some of the work that we're doing could end up not just being a way to comply with the ventilation requirements or comply with some other requirement, but actually end up having the benefits that we are doing our work to try to achieve be valued directly in the evaluation of the effectiveness of the retrofits and the overall home. Bill, that's the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's a one-time thing that was, I forget how much that was, like 800 and some billion dollars or something like that. And there are $3.5 billion were provided to the weatherization assistance program. And the language says until expended. What the DOE is trying to do is have that be actually for 5 years. I'm at a conference right now where yesterday the question came up to the DOE people presenting, will there be extensions to that? And they say, yeah, we're going to be doing no cost extensions to that. You're going to have more than 5 years to spend the $3.5 billion. If it was over 10 years, that essentially doubles the DOE portion of weatherization programs. One thing I should mention, when you have a weatherization program, it's typically not only DOE money. They're also able to take some money from the LIHEAP program, Low Income Home Heating Energy Assistance Program. They're able to take some money from that to put it into weatherization as well. So you braid those funds so you can do more homes and do more in each home. And then there's often state funds, maybe utility funds. So when I say it doubles the DOE portion, it doesn't mean it's doubling everybody's overall funds available, but it's doubling an important part of it, the kind of the foundation of it. So yeah, so we can, so that if that's again, if it's done over 10 years, which is I think more likely what it's going to end up being. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, also, they have money in there that's specifically to fund research into improvements to the program, into improvements into the weatherization program, looking at these non-energy impacts. That's part of how they're exploring how to account for it that I've got in the other column. Non-energy impacts. How do we do multifamily better? Multifamily buildings have historically been severely underserved. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Things such as benefits are supposed to accrue to the residents. Well, if somebody's renting and you're improving the rental housing, how do you have the benefits accrue to the residents? And then there are issues about you're working on somebody else's building, and if they don't see the benefit in it, maybe they don't want to participate. So there are a lot of issues with multifamily, but so that's part of what some of the bill fundings are for, is to figure out how can we do better and serve more people in multifamily buildings, because those are often some of the poorest of the poor. They really need help.
Can I ask a question? You said you couldn't see, so I'm just gonna jump in if that's okay.
Please do. Yep.
So I think the problem that you're describing of people not getting the benefits that might need them are pretty long-standing, correct?
Yeah.
And the bill and the IRA are like year and a half old kind of thing. And so who is it who's figuring these things out? Were there measures in place where people were saying, if only we had a program like this, it would be better, and then they're able to implement them? Or is there a sort of lot of craziness going on as people figure out how to implement it? And you might be going to talk about this, but I'm just curious.
No, it's great. So like with multifamily, there are some long-standing practices that are things like, in exchange for us being the government, paying for the retrofit, you, the landlord, will agree to freeze rents for 3 years, no rent increases for 3 years. And so that's a way that they will have benefits accrue to the residents. So there are some things that have been done for a very long time, and they're well established. This research is really going to be more like, are there ways that we um, can account for things in a way that are more attractive to landlords and get them in? Are there strategies to bring landlords into the discussion? Once we're in, are there approaches to do a better job of weatherizing multifamily buildings with advanced technology that maybe there hasn't been for decades? You know, what with all the technology that's going on now, all the stuff with solar, electrification, these mini split heat pumps, things like that, that are relatively new. Are there approaches that, you know, one of the advantages of multifamily buildings is if you can figure out good approaches, you've got them all in one building. You don't have to drive across town, so it can really scale nicely. So it's a lot of trying to figure out, again, how do we streamline the delivery of services? And then how do we get newer technologies into these buildings in a way that scales, benefits more people at a reasonable cost? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, partly. I'm curious, like, who are the people who are actually doing this? Right? Like, what is the community that's taking this on? Where are those? There must be some really big discussions. Where are they happening?
Yes. This funding here that's through the bipartisan infrastructure law, that is competitive grant funding from DOE. It's the Weatherization Assistance Program Enhancement and Innovation grants. My group in Illinois has one that's on healthy homes, and both Colorado and Illinois have put in for workforce development, which is what the WFD is. So what's happened is you've got, like at this conference that I'm at, you've got people from all the states talking about the real challenges they have. Here's where we are getting bottlenecked. Here's where we need help figuring out how to deliver services to people. We need help here. And so then DOE with NREL kind of manages a lot of this. They say, okay, here's what we're hearing are the biggest needs. And so they say those are the major topics that need to be addressed. And then they put out the FOA and say to anybody, give us your good ideas on this. One thing is, because it's intended for weatherization, it has to be connected to weatherization. So you do see, like, housing authorities, you see universities, you see a lot of different organizations, community-based organizations going after these funds, and sometimes these states themselves, the state weatherization program may go for it, or the subgrantees, that's the local agencies delivering the program. There's a whole bunch of folks who can go for it, but they have to be connected in some way, have some kind of partnership with the weatherization program. And then once you've got that, you've got these partnerships between people who have ideas about solutions with the people who would use the solutions, working together to try to drive that.
Paul,
Okay, thanks.
I had a quick question about what an NEI is.
Non-energy impact.
Oh, that's the non-energy benefit, but yeah, no benefit. Okay.
Right. So it could be things like improved nutrition. It could be things like improved health because of improved indoor air quality or getting rid of pests, anything related to healthy homes. It could be job related. There are a lot of different things that people look at where you've got these other benefits, hopefully benefits that, but maybe not, that you get because you're doing this work, but we're not the main thing. And certainly carbon reductions is one of them as well.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that had about $9 billion for housing. And that $9 billion is split in three categories. The first one is relatively small, $200 million for what's called Hope for Homes, and that is contractor training. That is recognizing that if we're going to get quality work done, we got to get people trained on how to do it. Otherwise, we can have a lot of really bad stuff getting put in, or we just don't even have the capacity of people. We've got boxes that could get installed if anybody was around to install the box. So it's a good bit of money for contractor training, because one problem the contractors have, they don't like to send their people for training because it costs them money instead of makes them money, and nobody's paying them to get their people trained. Well, this is saying there's money available to get your people trained to do some of these newer approaches or whole home approaches. So that's Hope for Homes. Then there's homes. I say 4.5 billion, it's really about 4.4 because it's 9 billion overall, 200 million carve out for the contractor training, and then the rest of it is split between homes and HERA. So homes is about rebates and tax credits for whole home energy efficiency. So it can be air sealing, insulation, lighting, other baseload topics. It's really about energy efficiency, reduction of energy need. And so that's stuff that is very aligned with weatherization, but it's not only for low-income families. And it's not necessarily going to the weatherization programs. It's rebates and tax credits, as opposed to the government is paying for it for low-income families. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. HERA is, I don't remember what all the letters stand for, but that's the electrification one. So it's rebates and tax credits also, in this case, for electrification. So electric stoves instead of gas stoves, heat pumps instead of gas furnaces. And so it's recognizing that one of the barriers to getting those technologies into homes is the cost. It can also pay for things like electric panel upgrades in order to be able to handle the load from, say, a heat pump. All of these things, yeah.
Do you mind, sorry for the interruption again,
Please.
but I was kind of curious for the electrification one, is there any expectation about what number of homes that is meant to convert?
So the maximum allowable, so it's rebates and tax credits with certain limits per technology. The maximum amount that any home can take out of that is $14,000. So if you divide $4.4 billion by 14,000, and you're pretty much there. As kind of a minimum number of homes.
And
I don't know.
Are there any stipulations about like what fraction has to go for cooking stoves versus like heating systems?
No.
Okay.
No, that's going to be, which things will do the residents want?
Okay.
One thing about homes and HERA is that these are being run through the state energy offices. Now, in some states like Colorado, the state energy office also runs the weatherization program, but that doesn't mean this is going to the weatherization program, because the state energy office does a lot of other things as well. Whereas in Illinois, the state energy office and the weatherization program is not a part of the state energy office. It's part of a totally different department. So they may or may not even talk to each other. And the state energy offices, honestly, right, you don't really see this money flowing yet. And that's because the Department of Energy has said, okay, we got all this money. They just in the last couple of weeks, released guidance on here are some things that the state energy offices, are going to need to do as part of your implementation. But the state energy offices have a lot of latitude to figure out exactly how they're going to administer these programs. And they to a very large extent, they don't know what to do. They're looking for a lot of help on how to implement these programs and what are the pathways to get the money flowing. Do you work with weatherization? And if so, how? Because it's a different business model. How do you do this? And so there's a lot of a lot of confusion right now, honestly, that's making it so that the money is not flowing. Narasimha, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Just back to the earlier question by Alison, I believe there's a maximum number of homes. The tax credits is unlimited, but of course, if you earn below a certain level of income, you don't really earn enough to gain from the tax credit. But the rebates apparently go to maximum of 1% of households. So that's 1 million odd homes in the US, I believe, so far as what I've heard. Have you heard of that? Is that correct?
I haven't heard people talking about it in quite that way, but that number works out, I think, about right.
Just 1 million homes have access to use a rebate?
Yeah, the low income rebate right now apparently is up to 1%.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe so. Yes.
Are you saying the cap on it, Narsima, that like it's like the electric cars, once so many have been taken, then they're not available to anyone else?
That's what I believe. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. I had a related question to this, sorry, because I guess, you know, for the respect group, we've been talking a lot about electrification or thinking about it. Does any of the rebate or tax credit go towards like a consultant or a contractor? Or does it all have to go to the hardware?
Some of it does go to contractors.
Okay.
Like, for example, any heat pump installation, there has
Yeah.
to be at least some amount of an assessment of the
Okay.
home.
Yeah.
And so you can get the assessment at least partly covered.
Okay.
So some of it is going to, and then another thing I don't show here, these are the rebates and tax credits to the resident. There
Yeah.
are also incentives of a few $100s paid directly to the contractor.
Yeah.
As a way to try to get them interested in really trying to push these programs.
Okay.
And Narasimha made a very important point that, the tax credits, there's a whole lot of people who don't pay taxes. And I actually, one time when there was an organization had this calculator and said, see how much you can save. So I went in just out of curiosity and I put in the exact same selection of things that I wanted to do, things that I was considering. I put in everything was the exact same except my income. And when I changed my income to the lower amount, which is like a tenth of the higher amount, neither one was the actual amount. I just put in numbers that were different by a factor of 10. The lower income people got a lot less money. And it's because they don't have access to the tax credits because they're not paying much in the way of taxes.
I think that limit has been calculated to be approximately $40,000 per home.
As an income level, you mean, Narasimha?
Yeah. Below that, you're probably not going to gain from the tax credit.
Right. Yeah, that's about right. You can still get the rebate. And when you are low income, the rebates can be a little bit better, as I'll show in a moment. But yeah, so there's a huge amount of money for all this stuff in the IRA, and the people are still just trying to figure out how are we going to do this. So here are some examples of what you can get from the IRA. You can get, if you are not low income, actually, I have this wrong. I just realized I typed this wrong. What it should say is you can get a non-low income family will get a 50% rebate for the installation cost of a heat pump up to a maximum rebate of $8,000. I say 50% of the first $8,000. It's a 50% rebate up to an $8,000 rebate. So they get up to a $16,000 heat pump installation. They'll get $8,000 back, and then they can also get a $2,000 tax credit. The low income family would get 100% rebate up to the 8,000. So both, so all income levels have a cap of $8,000 for heat pumps. The low income families will get all 8,000 on an $8,000 heat pump, but if they put in a $16,000 heat pump, they still only get $8,000. The moderate income family if they put in an $8,000 heat pump, they only get $4,000 back. But if they put that $16,000 heat pump in, they'll get that same $8,000 that the low income families do. So it'll actually push the lower income families to be putting in maybe cheaper heat pumps, because cheaper and less efficient heat pumps, because they're not going to be able to get additional rebates beyond that. It's kind of capped. Electric cooking, 50% rebate for up to $840. Weatherization, so that's getting back more into the homes part of all of this, not the HERA part. The weatherization part, 50% rebate up to $1,600, and then with a up to $1,200 tax credit. And if you're going to do the weatherization, so that's going to be like your insulation, your air sealing, things like that, then the audits need to be conducted by someone with one of several approved certifications. At 100% for low-income families, remember I said there's different ways to do that. Weatherization does 200% of poverty. This is up to 80% of area median income. And that's actually aligned with how HUD looks at their determinations for low income.
Hey, Paul, how do these compare to the actual costs? How much of the cost of the project is being paid by the government or is being borne by the occupant?
Yes, so a heat pump, if a house doesn't have a heat pump now, and so we're talking about having to get quite a bit of infrastructure put in, it's easy to have a brand new heat pump installation job be $20,000 right now. So, and that's in part because there might very well have to be electrical panel upgrades, et cetera, and so forth. So it can be very expensive if you don't already have all of the infrastructure there. And so the $8,000 is, in my mind, going to largely lock low-income families out of it, unless it gets braided into other programs. Ellison?
Yeah, so that might relate somewhat tangentially. You had said at the beginning it's okay if we go on some tangents, but feel free to table this. I remember after the ERA funding in Texas, there was a lot of discussion about if we put all this money into training people to do this work, but then there's no money to drive them being contracted later. Like, what are we doing about the long-term success of the labor or workforce being developed? And I'm not saying that as a criticism, it came to mind again, like that they're a critical piece, but if they get trained up on something that's going to only be a pulse of money for a few years, even if it's 10 years, maybe, what are they going to do after?
Well, that was a huge problem with how they did the ERA funding. We trained thousands of people, and shortly after you had thousands of people not in the industry who had gotten some kind of training, but they were doing something totally different, and it didn't work. And I think one of the things that is being done is it is being stretched out over a longer period of time. There is more clarity around career paths. And I think one of the expectations is that if you take the money and stretch it out over a longer period of time, then it isn't as huge of a bump. And so then by the time you get to the end of that, the regular formula will have probably continued going up. And now it's really not, it's an important increment, but it's not this huge bubble that bursts.
No, thanks for that perspective.
If I could add to that, some of the conversations I heard when I was at the meeting at NREL, not the one that the Respect team went to, but the JCEA one, there's a lot of discussion around workforce at DOE. And some of the things that they're talking about are how to train those people and have them have diverse skills. So they're not just stuck being installers, but they have something else to fall back on. I think another thing that they raised was the possibility of that. So there's some well, I don't know, you can't just take a coal worker and put them in and make them become an energy installer, but possibilities of using those jobs to kind of smooth out transitions that are already occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the things that's really being looked at, is these can be beneficial transitions for people in those types of sectors. Another thing is, when the ARA funding hit, most of the current certifications didn't exist. And so you didn't have this requirement for certifications. It wasn't really valued as much. And so I think that it's a much more established industry at this point. Doesn't mean it pays well enough for people to want to stay. But one thing also is, I don't hear anybody talking about how we've got more contractors than work. They're screaming in panic about not having workers to do all the work, even before the bill and Inflation Reduction Act. And so there are jobs for them, as long as they are jobs that people want to do and are compensated fairly. Narasimha?
Yeah, thanks. Just going back to the cost of heat pump question, um, I believe that it's quite variable. It depends upon the size of the home and the climate and the efficiency of the thing that you buy, et cetera, et cetera. But your point is, yeah, extremely important, that it can be much higher than people expect if you factor in all of the installation costs and the customization that's required for different homes. And I was just wondering, do you know of a data set that exists out there that's actual installation costs, so that we can try and estimate those additional costs? Because most of the time you see equipment costs, and those are, at least 20%, if not more, too low. And so it would be really useful to have a actual installation data set from which one can try and tease out all the retrofit stuff.
I think I know that there are data. I don't know if anybody has systematically collected it. And so I don't have a direct source to go to, or source like a journal article or anything like that. What I will say is, like, for example, Vermont has been doing a whole lot of this stuff. Vermont has been a real leader in electrification. They have some real benefits. One, most of their houses are like oil boilers. So oil is very expensive. It's a lot more expensive than natural gas. Because it's boilers, they're not doing ducted systems. So they don't have, so they're doing these, the mini splits. And so they've had a lot of success putting mini split heat pumps into homes around Vermont. And so that would be a state that I would consider going to ask for installation cost data, which would be specifically for that style of heat pump. It wouldn't be the ducted systems, but it would at least be a place to start on what is actually a pretty popular approach.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.
Yep. I
Sounds
know
like that would be an important thing, though, to try and figure out how to get hold of.
Yeah, and I know some folks in Vermont that the organization that were really driving that I could inquire about.
But Paul, if I can just ask a little bit more. So, in all of the mid-Atlantic and southern states, they've had a bunch of heat pumps for a long time, right? And,
Yeah.
Up to 10%, according to Rex 2020, up to 10% of homes have heat pumps. So, but what about those homes? We must be able to get hold of the actual cost somehow.
I wouldn't assume so, because a lot of those are going to be, first, they're probably going to be a little bit more expensive homes. Because they haven't necessarily been installed as a part of programs. And so we're talking about upper income homes already. Um, and then it's going to largely have been just kind of market rates. So nobody's collecting those data. You'd have to go to the contractor and say, what are you charging? And they're probably not going to tell you.
Yeah, I guess.
Let's see. Stacy has a question here. Any calculators for family to find out if they're in this income bracket? Yeah. So I think Rewiring America is the organization I went to when I was typing in the salary, the annual
Yeah, it's
income.
just sort of based on salary. It doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not like showing you showing the brackets. That's okay.
Right. But
It would be
yeah,
useful.
yeah. Okay, so I know we're pretty much at time. I still have 2 or 3 slides, and I do have another call at the top of the hour. I think I can go through it kind of quickly so we can wrap this up, and then if there are other questions, we can have them offline or whatever. So I mentioned that there are certifications. Is it okay for me to go on for a couple more minutes?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think perhaps just run through them, and it might be that now that people have seen this, we want to have just a whole separate discussion.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know exactly how to do something that takes longer than an hour, but yeah, go through the last few and just cover them, and then we'll see how to come back to it.
Okay. So I said that if there's going to be a weatherization work done, or if there's going to be a heat pump installed, then there's going to have to be a certified person here. The certifications that are allowed. There's one from ASHRAE, one from the Association of Energy Engineers, and then a couple from Building Performance Institute, and then one from Residential Energy Services Network. But for the first 2 of those, their focus is large buildings. They don't really know anything about houses. And so they're really focused on like your industrial buildings. So just as with other things we mentioned before, to the extent that they are actually relevant to this discussion, it's really going to be in the large multifamily. BPI, that is really the organization that has certifications for residential retrofit. And that's the ones that really, I think, are going to be the most important for this work. ResNet is really about new construction. So if you see a HERS rating, that's coming from ResNet, but that really is about new construction. Whole building organizations, I'm not so worried about like air conditioning contractors of America that are worried about the air conditioners. I'm going to focus on whole building organizations because that's where we're really kind of plugging in. BPI, the Building Performance Institute, they develop standards and credentials for folks in existing housing market. And then Building Performance Association is a membership organization that does advocacy, industry support, conferences. When we've talked about people going to a national practitioner conference, it's the one that they do. Then we've got ResNet that also is standards and ratings, but it's for new construction. ASHRAE, also standards and certifications, but mostly for larger buildings. They have just a small amount of effort towards the more housing that we think of. And then this is my last slide to acknowledge some of the politics that are driving a lot of this right now. Homes are around 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. I'm sure everybody's heard about gas stoves. It's just a huge, huge topic right now. Electrification, we talked about that a little bit, but that is a really massive point of discussion that's driving a lot of political discussions, policy discussions. A lot of people interested in building retrofit as part of climate change mitigation programs. From an energy program perspective, that would be one of the non-energy impacts, but there are a lot of people really interested in having all of this efficiency done, not just for energy or health, but be as part of their climate mitigation strategies. And then a lot of discussion about these other non-energy impacts. So I will stop there because that's my last slide.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I want to acknowledge that there could be a lot of questions, and we might have you back to have more discussion. If you have a question right now, that something that you're thinking of and we may not have time to cover, would you just write it down and put it in an email to Paul, so that your question can come out, whether you feel like it's a newbie question, or whether it's a digging into why does the law work that way. Probably anything will go. So anything that's at the top of your mind, put it down right now, and send it to paul.francisco@colestate.edu. And then we will certainly have to come back to this, but I hope it's given you a sense of the landscape that we're playing on.
you know, I'll just kind of echo that. I'm happy to take questions in email, and it's a very complex system, but there means there's also a lot of entry points. So if you can kind of see, if you can kind of understand the maze, lots of really awesome things can happen. There are entry points.
Thanks.
Thanks for your attention, everyone. I hope you found it helpful for the work you're doing in both projects.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.